Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. This time, however, we're doing something yet even more a little different. For starters, you might be confused as to why this American guy is talking and what he must have done with our beloved soothing-voiced Flemish host Jonas. Well, your regular Strategoi host will be back soon, but he's taking some time off to recover from difficulties with his vocal cords. If you want to keep in touch though, join our Discord. Jonas and I will be happy to chat with you there, and please do subscribe if you want to stay up to date. So in the meantime, I, Ryan, Strategoi's now semi-frequent guest, will be here providing you with a new series detailing the ins and outs of everything that is MathHammer. So here's a summary of what to expect in this video. We'll start by defining MathHammer itself, then giving some ins and outs of what's possible with this type of analysis tool, then giving a real-world example applying these concepts, and then lastly, giving you an idea of what to expect in the rest of our MathHammer series. But first, what exactly is MathHammer, you ask? MathHammer describes the use of probability theory and basic statistics to better come to terms with the likely outcomes of individual units and buffs, both in and unto themselves, but also in contrast to other generally similar units. So some examples we could use MathHammer for would be predicting the outcome of certain actions, like attacks or saves, comparing units while list building, or suggesting which buffs to use and when. While the math of it all might be overwhelming to some, our goal with this new recurring series is to ease everyone into using MathHammer in your own games and list building, all from the perspective of a data scientist who was also in a previous incarnation a career teacher. In fact, I find passing on knowledge one of the most rewarding parts of life, and if my insight into the world of probability helps even a couple of you get more out of your plastic toys, my job here will have been a success. But before we can do that, we need to be able to clearly set expectations for what MathHammer can and cannot do for you, as it isn't a foolproof method for winning your games, but rather a tool set to help you make smarter choices therein, including setting better expectations for what kind of results you'll likely see. What are 4 things that MathHammer cannot do for you? We have that MathHammer doesn't know all, that it isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of mechanism for figuring out your game, it cannot interpret a unit's secret sauce, quote-unquote, and it isn't nearsighted, but rather leans towards the long horizon. So, MathHammer doesn't know all. While the game of Warhammer is in fact an enclosed system of largely discrete outcomes with a limited number of ways to generate randomness, it still has way more variety and complex interactions that we can possibly capture using even the large set of metrics we can easily measure in the game. For those of you not steeped in the world of statistics or probability theory, maybe some of these concepts are already sounding a little abstract. For example, an enclosed system, in this case we mean a world unto itself that admittedly has less variables going on amongst the different elements, but is nowhere near as complicated as the full real world. So yes, this is a game and it is an enclosed system. The largely discrete outcomes is referring to outcomes that can be kind of rounded off to nearby values, say 1, 2, 3, or 4, instead of 1.56789, so forth, to an infinite level of precision. Most of the game will be talking about discrete outcomes, but when we talk about movement, this is one of the most obvious continuous outcomes that we can find because you don't have to move the full 5-inch movement of your movement characteristic, but rather could move any subtle difference in between nothing and 5 inches in that case. And finally, talking about metrics, what we really mean are different, usually derived features that we're going to be using, say threat range, which isn't exactly on a war scroll, or base size, also not on a war scroll. These are different metrics that we can kind of bring in to help learn a little bit more about how our units actually play in the real world. MathHammer isn't a one-size-fits-all analysis tool. In other words, MathHammer struggles to compare units that perform different roles. For example, a 10 model melee infantry unit is very difficult to accurately compare point for point with a 10 model shooting infantry unit, and both are nearly impossible to accurately compare to a 1 model hero of the same points cost. This all goes without even taking into account the fact that across different battle tomes, even the exact same war scroll with different allegiance abilities and battle traits could very well function less similarly than 2 seemingly different units in one book. So for example, Zongors in both Beasts of Chaos and Disciples of Tzeentch have exactly the same war scroll, but work very differently and even have different points costs. Whereas perhaps Zongors and Zongor Enlightened, which are two different units on the field with different war scrolls, in Tzeentch or in Beasts of Chaos might actually have more in common, even though they look different. MathHammer also can't interpret a unit's secret sauce. Even amongst relatively homogeneous units, or those with similar traits and roles, almost every war scroll these days has at least one special and sometimes completely unique rule on it. And while some of these are directly quantifiable with probability theory, for example exploding sixes to hit, many such special rules completely evade such direct valuation. Perhaps the best example of this is the value brought to a given unit via not only the movement characteristic in general, but even more so by so-called movement shenanigans in particular. As such, quantifying a 6-inch pile-in, a retreat in charge, or a reserved unit deep strike is almost a fool's errand, essentially impossible. And so for these sorts of more qualitative metrics or subjective tools that we use to help analyze a unit, we have to keep resorting to our guts as ever more experienced players. Lastly, MathHammer isn't nearsighted, but rather more farsighted. While we often value having a big picture idea of how the world works, your games of Warhammer are just that, single games. Therefore, due to a number of common psychological biases we all tend to share, oftentimes our experiences of how units work run counter to what the calculated math will end up saying about them. We've all seen a game where an opponent spiked a random roll at a crucial moment, but is that really what we should expect of that unit over time? While not all rolls have the same swinginess, i.e. variance in statistics terms, a far-sighted view of probability will help you balance out those expectations, while also allowing for big spikes from time to time. So now let's move on to 4 things that MathHammer can actually do for you. MathHammer can help you learn your army. It can bring some sense to the randomness of dice rolls. It illuminates weaknesses in your opponent's armies, and it teaches you about yourself. So now let's take a look at how MathHammer can help you learn your army. Battle tomes are complicated, and even without beginning to look at broad-scale battle traits and allegiance abilities, many army books contain enough similar units and or weapon configurations that it can be difficult to get your head wrapped around anything but the rule of cool, or just taking units that you think are awesome. Using probability theory can help point you in the right direction for how to build those models and or lists. Meanwhile, optimizing synergies and squeezing as much juice out of your beloved minis without compromising what made you love them in the first place. So for example, maybe you, like me, absolutely adore elite cavalry armies. But though you are fully aware that writing such lists often presents an uphill battle, pun intended, against more optimized lists, there are still choices you can make to make your horse boys all that they can be. And that is why knowing is half the battle. Insert G.I. Joe meme here. MathHammer can also bring a sense to the randomness of the dice world. Need to know whether that all-out attack is necessary for your last unit to attempt to slay the warlord battle tactic? We've got math for that. Unsure whether that +1 to cast artifact is necessary to get off that crucial spell when there's another juicy option staring you right in the face? We've got you covered. Are you tired of being disappointed by never seeing your hero actually perform max potential damage and would therefore like a more reasonable baseline to rely upon? Look no further, my friends. The good thing about math in the appropriate context is that we often can actually take some of the feel bad of randomness out of the picture, especially if you're the type of person that really can't stand that sort of thing, foreshadowing intended. Next up, we have that MathHammer can help illuminate the weaknesses in your opponent's armies. No army can be a perfect jack of all trades, no, not even cities. And your main task in being a stronger player is knowing how to exploit your opponent's army's weak points. Sure, some units might be out of balance in the meta at large, but we've also seen people slowly, through brute force experience, come to find answers to these problems with clever list building and tactics. MathHammer can simply help you get there faster, though of course some grinding is always welcome. And MathHammer can teach you about yourself. And as we had kind of foreshadowed a couple points ago, Some people are risk-seeking, while others are quite risk-averse. In a game filled with random dice rolls and 25-plus armies each lying somewhere on a spectrum, after months of playing with a given army, you might find yourself subconsciously gravitating away from one you thought you'd like, only to find yourself months later loving one that at first glance totally wasn't your thing. At the end of the day, not everyone plays the same way, and dice throws play a giant part in how this manifests itself in your games, and possibly life in general. So now that we've covered what we can and cannot expect of MathHammer, let's take a look at an example, a somewhat snarky example in fact. After reviewing my ideas for this intro video, I was encouraged to give you all a sneak peek of what applying MathHammer in the real world might look like in action. And of course, being the Lumineth-centered channel this is, I wanted to shoot for an interesting case from that army, one that was simultaneously non-trivial, but also a bit of a bonus throwaway, since this breakdown will be hidden towards the end of this intro video anyway. Thus, the unit we'll be looking at is the not-so-adored Cenari Calligrave, and in particular, his weird War Scroll spell, Erasure. By the way, do we know that the Calligrave is a guy? I don't know. A quick note about the level of math difficulty for those of you out there feeling your spider senses going off. While I can't possibly control for every level of mathematics knowledge and familiarity each of you have, I want to make sure all these videos are as clear as possible, so your feedback will be important in this pursuit. Also, while the example we're about to dive into might feel a bit too far into the deep end for some of you, please know this is just an example of where we can go, and I fully intend to start with the basics for our first few videos out the gate. So for all but the more experienced math hammerers out there, the goal is to get you feeling comfortable with these tools as soon as possible so we can all take this journey together. And now back to our friendly Calligrave and the Erasure spell. Let's start by walking you through the spell's exact wording before we go down the MathHammer rabbit hole. Erasure has a casting value of 7. If successfully cast, pick one enemy hero within 24 inches of the caster. You can either inflict D3 mortal wounds on that hero, or mark them for Erasure. However, if that hero is already marked for Erasure, then instead they suffer D6 mortal wounds and they are no longer marked for Erasure. That's a lot of erasures in there. So basically what we're looking at is a bimodal spell that allows you to swing for what appears to be a high-risk, high-reward option instead of safer but less swingy direct damage. By the way, bimodal here just means we have two options, option A or option B. Thus, what we really want to do here is run a little probability experiment where we compare the two options, either going big for the D6 mortals, which takes 2 turns to accomplish, or using those 2 turns to just do the D3 version twice. If you already know a bit about expected values, you're probably aware that 2d3 comes out to 4 mortal wounds in the long run, whereas a single d6 equates to 3.5. We'll talk about how both of these were calculated in another video in the near future. So right off the bat, you're already inclined to say that the 2d3 choice is smarter, though admittedly only better by a half mortal wound on average, right? Well, this is where some serious math hammering really takes this problem in an interesting direction. Let's kick it off with assuming that in each of our experiments, both spells successfully go off. We'll later break down why this assumption is far from safe, but let's press pause on that for a minute. While it's easy to see what kind of results we might get with a d6, summing 2d3 might not be as clear for all of you, but fortunately the explanation will function as an easy introduction into how calculating a 2d6 roll works, which we'll cover also in another future video. In short, we have 9 possible outcomes. One where we get each of the doubles, so as seen in this chart, we're looking at the diagonal line that goes from the upper left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner. So this would be 1 and 1, 2 and 2, or 3 and 3. And then we have all the remaining values, which would be all 6 of the other permutations, which is a fancy way of saying not only 1 and then 2, but 2 and then 1, and then all the other permutations. Our next step will be converting our first chart, seen here, into one featuring the sums of these 9 outcomes. This will give us a pattern that will be emerging amongst the diagonal lines that run from bottom left to upper right. So first, let's look at the 2 alone in the upper left-hand corner. The 2 is the only 2 that we have in the chart. And so out of 9 options, we only have one way to get 2 damage out of 2d3. That would be if I roll double 1, Snake Eyes. Moving on, we have double the amount of options for 3. So 2 options for the number 3. That would be the next diagonal line we see there. So there are 2 ways to get it, with either 2 plus 1 or 1 plus 2, giving us a 2 out of 9 chance. Our next diagonal line gives us 3 4s. This is clearly the most common option that we have of all the options we've listed here. That would be either with a 3 and a 1 and a 3, or both 2 and 2 added together. We call this the modal outcome because it represents the most common single outcome of our potential outcomes. Moving on to 5s, we'll start to see that the process reverses here because we have 2 5s on this the second to last diagonal here, and those 5s represent 3 plus 2 or 2 plus 3 and occur 2 out of 9 times. Lastly, and clearly our only other option, is 1 out of 9 times that we'll get a 6, which is only occurring when we do a 3 plus a 3. So now our next step in these experiments is to compare each of these outcomes to a potential d6 roll, with our goal of only highlighting the chances that the roll on the d6 is better than the potential 2d3 sum that we got. When I'm talking about a d3 here, of course, I'm not talking about what it looked like on the die before we converted it into a 1, 2, or 3. I'm talking about the roll as if it were only a 1, a 2, or a 3. So 1 and 2 on a d6 makes it a 1, or 3 and 4 makes it a 2, and so on. So moving back to this chart that we've added to the page here, if we look at the 2d3 roll, resulting in 2 mortal wounds, so this would be the first row here in the new chart, a d6 would only outperform it, so be higher than 2, strictly higher than 2, on a d6 roll of 3, 4, 5, or 6, thus a 3 plus. So we know that this means that 4 out of the 6 possible d6 rolls would be higher than a 2. So in the chart here, we see the probabilities of each of these 5 outcomes. So there are 4 out of 6 chance that we end up getting d6 greater than 2, or a 3 plus, a 3 out of 6 for a 4 plus, 2 out of 6 for 5 plus, 1 out of 6 for 6 plus, and notably, because we said the d6 has to be strictly higher than a 6, that would equate to a 7 plus, which we know is impossible, so there's a 0 out of 6 chance that we get that. Now, all we have to do is multiply the chance that we got a given 2d3 sum, which we calculated above, by the chance that a d6 roll would be better than that specific 2d3 sum, and then sum all of those 5 combos up. So, as we can see here, we take the chance that we got a 2 on 2d3, which is 1 out of 9, multiply that by the chance that the d6 roll would be higher than 2, which is a 4 out of 6. Then we repeat for the next 4 circumstances. So when we actually work these out, you're going to see that everything is over 54, which means just 9 times 6 in the denominator there. And then we're just going to add them all together. So we got 4 over 54 plus 6 over 54 plus 6 over 54 and so on, which eventually gives us 18 over 54, which then of course can be reduced to 1 over 3, 1/3. And now we come to the inconvenient truth part of the video. So you might be saying, but Ryan, 1/3 of the time isn't that bad of a gamble to get the swingier output, right? Well, naturally this depends a bit on your risk aversion level, as mentioned earlier. But what if I told you that the risk is actually way worse than it has appeared thus far in the analysis? Remember earlier when I said we were going to assume both spells in an experiment would go off? Well, now we're going to put our experiments to test in a much better representation of the real world, where we have casting value 7 spells only going off 58% of the time. Speaking of which, I'm super psyched to break down everything I know about spellcasting odds in a later video, including pluses to cast and what your real chances are if your opponent has an unbind, but just trust me on this one for now. So, back to the math. There are 3 basic scenarios we have in our experiments. The one where neither of our 2 spells go off, the one where only one of the 2 spells goes off, and then of course our initial assumption that both spells go off. Sparing you the math, but only for now, as we can see in the chart on screen, it turns out that the first case, i.e. of no spells going off, will end up happening just a little more than 1/6 of the time, at 17.36%, and clearly in this case the D6 version isn't strictly better than 2D3, which is all we really care about, since ultimately no damage is done either way, thus not strictly better. I've notated this here in the chart as under successful casts, neither one of them goes off, so it doesn't apply, not applicable. And then the chance percentage, is the likelihood that this situation happens. So 2d3 damage, there's no damage. 1d6 damage, no damage. And the chance that a d6 is greater than 2d3, there's a typo on the slide here, is 0%. So that's relatively easy to kind of get your head wrapped around. Our second case is the one where only one spell actually goes off. Perhaps it's the first one you attempt, perhaps the second, but it's not both, and it's not neither. This situation happens almost 50% of the time at 48.61%, which means that while the D3 spell got off at least one mortal wound, because you got to roll a D3 one time, the D6 version only resulted in the target getting marked for erasure, which of course means no wounds were actually inflicted. The guy just has a weird, silly name on him now. So it's still not better than a single D3. So in the chart we can see it's a 1D3 versus the guy got marked. And that is happening at 48.61%. 1 to 3 damage on the 2d3 because we now know it's a 1d3, and nothing on the d6 because he's just marked. So the d6 is still not better than 2d3, or even 1d3 in this case. Thus, our only remaining outcome where the d6 could be better is where both spells go off. But as we can see, that only happens a little bit more than 1/3 of the time itself. So I've marked it as 2d3 versus 1d6, which is the case we've already covered, and it's happening 34.03% of the time, where the 2d3 is doing somewhere between 2 to 6 damage, the 1d6 is doing 1 to 6, and like we said before in our previous calculations, this happens about 1/3 of the time, well exactly 1/3 of the time. So now we multiply this probability by the original 1/3 chance we found that the d6 would outperform the 2d3. Which brings us to a disappointingly not so grand total of an 11.34% chance that a d6 is better. Much lower than what you probably expected when we just looked at, okay, the expected value of 2d3 is 4, and the expected value of a d6 is 3.5. And now let's cover the aftermath, pun intended. So unless you're a super risk seeker, you're now probably no longer going to think of this D6 option as reasonable. And that's not to speak of the other spell alternatives you could have chosen, or the possibility that you'll go ahead and kill the target before your next hero phase without using this marked for erasure ability. Or the additional ease with which a marked hero could avoid the follow-up wounds, either by moving out of the 24-inch bubble for the spell, or having his army just kill your most likely only Caligrave, because let's be honest, you're probably not taking 2. Oh, and I haven't even gotten into exactly how much more damage the D6 version would have done, since up to this point, all we focused on was whether he would do any amount more, which could have ultimately been marginal. And here we are, having painstakingly broken down a War Scroll spell that you were all probably well aware kinda sucked, even if you couldn't put into words why it felt that way, or furthermore prove it. So why not just go with our guts? Well, in this case, it might not have been so necessary, but there are plenty of other abilities out there in the game that also set traps for the unwary player, but are nowhere near as obvious, so having a set of tools to help suss that out could be quite helpful. But at the end of the day, even if this wasn't necessary to do, some of you out there in Strategoi land are going to simply find joy in being made aware of curious mathematical facts about the game's dice rolls. Or perhaps you'll find joy even in solving little puzzles like these yourselves. And as such, I'm more than happy to share my love for MathHammer with all of you sympathetic souls. So as we near the end to this video, it might be good to discuss what we might be covering in the future videos in this series. Over the course of this series, we plan to take both an entry-level and deep dive into the world of MathHammer, so not everything will be as heavy as seen in the example given here. The series content will cover everything from potential dice throw outcomes and how to compute them, to useful in-game derived features like expected damage per 100 points, or expected output over the whole game relative to how tanky your unit is. Further on, we'll explore how to compute near surefire bets that your unit will perform the way you need them to in a pinch, and perhaps even how to set up your own Excel files to compute both common and less common likelihoods. Speaking of which, we could also do a survey of all of the existing MathHammer tools that exist on the internet so that we can, maybe discuss what I think are useful traits to these and maybe some that are missing some useful qualities. But though this series might initially feel a bit pedantic or maybe a little condescending, especially if you're already pretty comfortable with probability theory, and of course that's not our intention, we eventually want to see these videos evolve into an interactive space where you can present us with all your burning MathHammer related questions, which we'll then try to tackle to the best of our abilities. And hell, along the way, it'll probably end up making us all better experts at this dice game we love so dearly. In the meantime, thank you for your interest and support in both the channel at large and these MathHammer videos. It means a lot to us. And please leave your comments and questions in the comments section below. Like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. We're super excited about this project and hope to light that fire temple hot MathHammer flame in you as well. Until next time, Ryan out.